Hello, everyone. My name is Martijn van der Meer, and together with Ilja Nieuwland and Marike Hendriksen, we are organizing this webinar series, Gewina Goes Open, I would almost say, on history of science and open science as a reflection webinar series. And we hope you very much enjoy that. So there is currently a lot of momentum for various reform movements in the context of academia, addressing several structural problems such as WO in action, science in transition, and also the open science movement. And especially somehow this open science movement seems to be the one that is broadly adopted by science policymakers, funders, and university executives. So there are a lot of open science communities and other grassroots initiatives almost institutionalized at all these universities, especially in the Netherlands. And it's interesting that both this movement seems to urge for methodological scrutiny, and on the other one needs to or feels the urgency to stress the connection with society. And it's interesting that both sides find one another in this call for radical transparency. So they present themselves, or this group of reformers present themselves as new, focusing on open access and open data and incentive structures, open education, and also public engagement. And it's interesting that a wide range of perspectives, approaches, and also people in academia are participating. Also, both frustrated statisticians urging for methodological scrutiny, and these idealistic people talking about connection with society. So we from Gewina, the Dutch Society for History of Science and University History, and also the Belgium one, and from the Benelux, was wondering, so is this new? What is happening at this point in society specifically that makes it feel as if this openness is an important ideal in academia? And does that relate to all sorts of disciplines? And I think we all were quite wondering where all the humanities scholars are in this open science movement, and more specifically, where the historians are left in this open science movement. So with this webinar series, we both try to see this open science movement as an object of study, I would say, and on the other hand, I think it's all a call for again engaging in these debates more specifically. What we are going to do in the next weeks or next months is discuss open science as a historical phenomenon. I think that's what we do today. Also discuss the ideals in open science at the 27th of November with Klaas van Berkel and Laia Beierman. On the 11th of December, look at specific historical or open science practices, especially in relation to peer review and publishing with Noortje Jacobs and Jeroen Zondervan. On the 15th of January, we are going to ask ourselves whether or not open science is an ideal, is a very Eurocentric phenomenon with Irina Podgorny and Marta Lourenço. And on the 22nd of January, we are trying to discuss whether historians of science should or should not engage with this open science movement, together with Doreen Darling and Frank Miedema. But today we have Ivan Flis, a psychologist turned historian and philosopher of social science, as he likes to call himself, and currently a postdoc at the Department of Psychology at the Catholic University of Croatia in Zagreb. But he has also a PhD in history and philosophy of science from Utrecht University. He is interested in the history of 20th century methodology and historically informed social psychology. And he will give a talk about the recent history of the methodological crises in psychology and its ties to the recent open science movement. So how we are going to do this, Ivan will give a talk, and then we can discuss together on a wide variety of topics, supervised by Ilja.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. So I'm very happy to be back at the Gewina event, even if it's virtual. It's been a couple of years since I last went to a conference. Since I moved from the Netherlands, I haven't been to any of the events. So I hope this talk is going to be interesting for you. I have 20 minutes, right, for the talk itself, just to check.
Yeah, about.
About. Okay. So I'm going to talk about open science as a type of reform movement, and go into some of our, let's say, late historical antecedents of what led to the open science as a movement and as advocacy groups developing. And my perspective is crucially tied to what's happening in scientific psychology, especially in the quantitative subdisciplines of scientific psychology. So the psychologists using a lot of statistics and a lot of inferential statistics in particular. But before we turn to psychology at the end, also I'm going to conclude with some critical remarks about the open science movement, like points of reflection, and also with a question where we as historians and other scholars of science from the humanities can participate in these conversations, and what should be done, or what are the kind of places where our perspective might be valuable in that sense. Okay, so we got a nice introduction. Oh, does this work? It doesn't work. That's a problem. Like this. Yeah. Okay. So we know that most of us working at today's universities have heard something about open science, right? It's like a buzzword that's spread through the university, so to say. Like in the Netherlands, especially so. I saw that Frank Miedma is going to give a talk at the end of this talk series. So he was, for example, appointed the first chair in open science at Utrecht University. On the other hand, we also have other institutional developments that spread worldwide, like, for example, the initiative for top guidelines, which is an initiative for reforming review in scientific journals that has more than 5,000 signatories, which is individual journals, but also different publishers or learned societies that kind of subscribe to this idea of top guidelines. The guidelines were developed from the Center for Open Science in Virginia, which is a really neuralgic institutional point for a lot of open science initiatives I'm going to talk about today and in general. And it's actually been founded by, among other people, its current director, an experimental social psychologist, Brian Nosek. So what are the top guidelines? It's basically a development of 8 standards where journal editors are called to implement open science practices like improved citation standards, improved data transparency, but also some changes in research practices that are really corely related to the innovations produced within the so-called replication crisis that has been happening for the last decade or so within experimental social psychology, within other subdisciplines of psychology, but also wider within biomedicine and other disciplines completely unrelated to psychology. So kind of a lot of stuff is happening in psychology, but by no means is open science a product of psychology, so to say. These initiatives that are related to the replication crisis is pre-registration of studies and pre-registration of analysis plans, and a focus on replication, the last 3 that you see here. Basically, pre-registration is this, I don't know if you heard about it, but it's this idea that the article format should be separated into an research design and analysis plan that's published and reviewed before the data is collected. And this will supposedly help with how inferential statistics is used and how data is analyzed, and help combat something called the publication bias, this problem that only positive results are being published. So this is huge, basically. With 5,000 signatories, top guidelines are a really huge institutional factor changing how science is being done. On the other hand, as Martijn has mentioned, there's this, it's not only institutional, but it's also grassroots in a sense, involving students and young researchers, how they are usually called in these conversations ERCs, or early career researchers. This is an example that came from the United Kingdom. Reproducibility is a journal reading club, basically, concerning itself with open science topics, reproducibility, and etc. That was started by psychology PhD candidates and one student. She was actually at the time studying in Amsterdam. And it has spread worldwide, and now there are like these journal clubs in 25 different countries and 100 institutions. So it's really, really gaining steam. There's multiple initiatives like that. So in the Netherlands, you have the open science communities. I think every Dutch research university now has an open science community of its own. So there's quite a few of these grassroots initiatives. On the other hand, open science also includes what I would call its empirical arm, so to say. In 2019 at Stanford, a big conference on meta-science was held, and how the newfangled or newly declared meta-scientists say meta-science is an emerging field of research on the scientific process. We would recognize it very much as some kind of admixture of scientometrics, statistics, and sociology of science, because they try to empirically research exactly the topics that open science advocates are interested in from the advocacy perspective. And very often this research is done to inform like evidence-based interventions within the science system. So they study publication behaviors, citation behaviors, what's called incentive structures coming from economics, and etc. So really like this a reinvention of an empirical branch of studying science, and very often there's very little place for perspectives that we are familiar with. So very few historians, philosophers, STS scholars engage with meta-science thus far. And last but not least, the replication crisis itself, which broke out, I would say in 2015, but there were antecedents happening before that, and really broke into the mainstream media too. Here's an article from Vox, basically saying, covering the replication crisis. Many mainstream media basically covered this issue that much research doesn't replicate in disciplines like psychology, biomedicine, and etc. That has really gained traction and gained steam in wider society, not only within the academia. So what is open science then? What are these advocates pushing for, and what are they advocating for, and what is so compelling about it? There's a couple of historical antecedents, I would say. I'm not aware of a really comprehensive history of open science that it has been written yet. So there are some bits and pieces that I think really play an important part in what open science is nowadays. The first thing that I'd like to mention is the free software movement and open source movement and community that has developed in the 80s and the 90s, which is basically, you can see a lot of reflections of these initiatives among software engineers in the ongoing open science advocacy groups, not only in the ideology and the language of openness and freedom to access products of intellectual work, in the case of software movements of software, in the case of open scientists of scientific products, but you can also see the parallels in the very tools that are being developed there. So many of the open science software tools, platforms, and etc. that are developed are either open source or freely available, and this is a huge strength of it, and advertised as such. A good example is the popularity and widespread advocacy for using R as a package and a language and a tool for data analysis instead of proprietary softwares like SPSS, for example. On the other hand, one really huge movement that was kind of, in the last years, I would say even subsumed into open science is actually open access. And with open access, we do have some better histories on where it comes from. With like in this recent history with Stephen Harned's subversive proposal from 1994, well, he called scientists to publish their esoteric writings on the FTP servers so anybody can read them, so they're not locked behind publisher paywalls. And this conversation morphed in the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002 and really launched this big movement that had a big impact on the publishing systems and how publishing works in science worldwide, especially in English. On the other hand, open data is another thing relevant for open science. This is also, many open data advocates actually are not scientists, but they come from the perspective of advocating at governments to free up public data gathered by public institutions. So it's not only scientific data, but also scientific data, meaning data gathered at universities or institutes of research, but also at public institutions in liberal democracies. Another one is of open educational resources, which is a kind of a strong movement pushing for free online resources like textbooks, but also lectures, etc., which really gained traction, especially in the United States, considering the really prohibitive costs of textbooks that university students there have to buy to participate in class. And last but not least, open peer review, which is really, really closely related to open access advocacy. But it's much more radical in that sense because it's attacking what's perceived by many scientists as a fundamental of the scientific process nowadays, and that's the gatekeeping of peer reviewers in journals. Many of the advocates in open science and open access movements became really, really radically critical of the value of review, and many perceive it as a cause of many of the systematic problems that exist in the science system. So that's really like a rough picture of the kinds of things that come into open science that I think are super relevant. I'm really open to adding to this perspective. As I said, this is not a comprehensive history in that sense. Okay, so open science sociologists of knowledge said in 2014, two of them, that open science is an umbrella term that encompasses almost any dispute about the future of knowledge creation and dissemination. And I think this kind of language is really indicative of the new open science movement and advocacy. It's really almost colonial in the way that it's kind of gathering any kind of criticism of the scientific process under its wing. And open science advocates are relabeling themselves as these critics that are going to solve the problems of knowledge creation. I think this is going to raise eyebrows from most of the historians in the audience, and I think this is one of the critical spaces that we can definitely talk about. The same sociologists made an analysis of the different kinds of or schools of open science advocacy in the movement. And I think this is also quite useful for getting your bearings on what open science is. I'm not going to go through their whole analysis, but they basically divide the movement into schools that are focused on different assumptions and different goals with what they're trying to do with their advocacy and changes. For example, the pragmatic school is very oriented on knowledge creation and how to make it more efficient. They see their advocacy as increasing and optimizing the scientific process, while on the other hand, the democratic school has the idea that access to knowledge is unequally distributed, and this is not right. So it's very ideological in the sense that everybody should have access to knowledge and we should democratize access. So this is very, very much harks back to open access, for example, as well with the public school. So we can see that open science is really not monolithic. It's really varied, and it really involves very many groups projecting different goals in the way that they want to change science and why they want to change it to begin with. So in that sense, all these groups, I think, give shape to what I would call a disruptive movement. So they very often, all these initiatives in a way want to disrupt the status quo, want to disrupt how science is done, and offer this new idea of scientific practices for the future, which are open, right? And this disruption goes on a number of levels, right? On the policy and governance levels, we see in the funding agencies, for example, NVO, when the replication crisis broke out, NVO dedicated millions to replication studies. Open access is a crucial part of funding agencies, and there are very many policy initiatives that force funding agencies to require open access publishing rights. Right? Governments are very involved. For example, the Dutch government also was very involved in the early years of the open access movement, and you get some Dutch ministers really vocally proclaiming open access as a future goal for science. The same is on the EU level or American federal level, where advocacy has been successful in implementing open science requirements and policies on those levels. On the other hand, the corporate stakeholders in these industries are really keen on participating in these initiatives. The publishing industry has a lot of experience with co-opting this these grassroots ideological movements of scientists and turning those movements into publishing platforms or business models. Open access is, I think, a paradigmatic example of that, how it started as this kind of ideological, radical idea that knowledge needs to be free, and nowadays it turned into a multi-million industry within the publishing industry, where the revenue stream was switched from access to publishing, right? On the other hand, in open science in particular, you get a big number of science startups. So startups trying to monetize on different scientific practices like review, for example, or social interaction. For review, you get Publons, for example, as a startup that's trying to open up review and actually earning money from that. Or the very familiar ResearchGate or Academia Edu as social network society for scientists. So corporate stakeholders are kind of getting on the ride, and they are developing new ways to monetize these initiatives, right? And scientists themselves, on the other hand, self-organize into open science communities. They are very keen on changing things. They are very driven as with the idea of improving science, and they're really, really participating widely in these initiatives, often in places of institutional power as journal editors, for example, or reviewers at funding agencies, etc. So the disruptive movement takes shape on multiple levels with multiple types of actors, right? From individual scientists to corporate stakeholders to policy officers in governments and funding agencies. All in all, open is in, right? And in that sense, I find it really fascinating, the part of open science that I think this call for openness becomes particularly interesting when calls for transparency from the advocates become rallying cries for certain kinds of research. So it's not only on institutional reform, but it's actually a change in scientific practices, how knowledge is actually being produced. And the replication crisis and the open science advocates involved in the replication crisis, I think, provide a really, really good starting point for looking at this. So I'm not going to go into the whole contours of the replication crisis. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument here in the presentation, that it's something that really took shape in the last 10 years, and the open science advocates are really involved in it as providers of solutions. So for sciences like experimental psychology or parts of experimental psychology that have been diagnosed with these problems with replicability, that much of the research that's published doesn't replicate, has open science advocates as reformers that are offering open science practices like pre-registration, analysis pipelines, innovations in software, in policy, etc., as solutions that are going to fix the system and individual behavior that's going to lead to more reproducibility. And that's absolutely fascinating, but because these reformers actually employ a really crucial model of a scientist and a model of a science system. So their idea of a scientist is as this irrational, biased individual who is trying to learn something about the object of their research, and they're operating in a science system that can either act as a corrective or compound the individual biases. So this bias talk has a really interesting history where it comes from behavioral economics and decision-making theory in psychology, like theories of rationality that started developing during the Cold War up to now, basically. But what happens in the reform is that they're basically saying the science system doesn't correct the irrationality of individual scientists, but it actually compounds the bias. It turns individual bias into systemic bias on the level of whole disciplines. And the only corrective for this, or the best corrective that they could think of, is open science practices. It's transparency, it's pre-registration, it's combating publication bias, etc. So it's reforming the science system to make individual biased scientists behave. This reform of the science system also spans multiple levels, right? It goes on the institutional reform, so trying to reform the publishing system, coming up with new publishing formats, but also having this big talk of incentive structures, this very economic language coming from economics about the idea that this system has a prestige economy and incentive structures that direct individual scientists, give them incentives toward, well, sometimes really, really degenerative goals, or goals that don't serve the main values of their communities, right? On the other hand, it's also focused on methods. So there's a methodological reform in it, in how statistic education is done, new innovative statistics introduced, fixing statistical practices that already exist to increase rigor and to make scientists use them properly in that sense. So it's very kind of And sometimes it's almost paternalistic in that sense, that the reform movement is going to provide solutions to all these scientists who don't know what they're doing. And third, and I think one of the most interesting points for us historians, is the explicit goal of reform through change of culture. And I think the Center for Open Science that I mentioned before, where these social psychologists are really engaged in the reform, is really interesting for that, because they are really thinking of science as a collection of cultural practices, and they're applying their knowledge from social psychology and sociology and fields like that to actually change individual behavior. So they're developing interventions that work, for example, trying to change behaviors with groups that are racist, or groups that are misbehaving, are not saving the economy or saving the environment. All these interventions that are trying to change individual behavior in those applied settings are now moved to science behavior, to scientific communities. So, for example, they're trying to nudge scientists in certain directions. Nudging is this concept that comes from these social sciences that's very popular in them. All in all, the last thing that I think it's absolutely fascinating here is that we are seeing a real enactment of the idea of the scientific knowledge being a network of the literature. So within these reform debates, we really see a strong direction where knowledge is reified as the literature and literally visualized and made into a thing. And I think empirical meta-science plays a really huge role in this, in kind of developing the tools and providing the advocates with the pictures, with the technologies, with the methods to actually analyze this, but also to develop then interventions that are perceived by the communities using them as evidence-based, right, which is very important. Okay, with that, how do we take critical distance from this? Like, what is the take-home message for us as commentators or people who think really thoroughly about scientific practice? For the first part, I think there's an outsized role of psychologists and social scientists because of the replication crisis. So the conversation very often equates open science and the replication crisis, which I think is hugely problematic. Open science harks back to initiatives that were developed much before the replication crisis. They just came under the spotlight because there was a necessity to really change something by many of the scientists involved in the replication crisis debates, and open science came as a solution, right, or as a series of solutions. These solutions very often end up as one-size-fits-all solutions. So science is very often flattened in what scientists do. I very often get this impression that there's this singular idea of what methods in science are, and the solutions are going to solve all the problems. And I think some of the meta-scientists and the advocates are really keenly aware that that's not the case. But on the other hand, they're behaving strategically in the sense that they need to provide solutions that then get a life of their own. There's a specific example of that. There are big discussions about pre-registration now happening, especially among psychologists, because pre-registration is getting some pushback from some communities who are saying that it's very imperial in the way that it's trying to reform scientific practice. On the other hand, another point of critical distance, I think, from the open science movement is trying to think about it in the mode of all the Silicon Valley language and this talk of disruptive technology. I also participated in that because I call it a disruptive movement. So there's a lot of like this impression that with all these startups and with the language that's used, with the incentive structures and et cetera, disruption, that this is really a type of neoliberalization of what's left at the university. And you get some really staunch critics like that, like Philip Mirovsky a couple of years wrote a scathing article calling out open science as just the newest instance of platformization of science. And last but not least, I would like to conclude with that is to ask you, what role should historians and other scholars of science play in this? So meta-science is being developed and really funded by millions of dollars and euro, both in the Netherlands, in the United States, and across the world. From my impression is that there are very few historians and philosophers actually engaging with these perspectives, and I think that's a huge loss. On the other hand, I have been engaging with the open science movement, and actually I perceive myself as a fellow traveler in that sense, who's sympathetic to the movement. But I struggled myself to articulate perspectives that would, A, be critical and informative about the open science movement, and B, in some way participate in what's happening at the universities we also share with the other scientists. So with that, I think I would like to conclude.